Good morning. Welcome to the School of Theology's annual St. Luke's Lectures and Alumni Homecoming. It's so wonderful to have you all here, especially those who have traveled quite far to be with us. It's my privilege to introduce our lecturer. Dr. Donyelle McCray serves as Associate Professor of Homiletics at Yale Divinity School. A teacher, writer, and Episcopal layperson, her scholarship focuses on ways African American women and lay people use the sermon to play, remember, invent, and disrupt. She's the author of The Censored Pulpit, Julian of Norwich as Preacher, and a volume on the sermon genre, Is It a Sermon? Art, Activism, and Genre Fluidity in African American Preaching. In her 3 lectures with us, Dr. McCray will draw us into the work of the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, a path-breaking poet, activist, attorney, professor, and Episcopal priest, whose legacy of human rights work continues to be a powerful influence to this day. Please welcome Dr. Donyelle McCray.
Good morning. Good morning. Well, I just have to say good morning and thank you. You have welcomed me in a way that's unprecedented. I have been welcomed in words and smiles and flowers and homemade bread, beef stew, apple cake. I have been welcomed with check-in calls and rides all around this beautiful place that so many of you call home and a spiritual home, and I'm just so glad to be with you. Our time together feels especially precious in the wake of Hurricane Helene and the heartbreak that so many are feeling. And so I thank you for making time to be here. And I hope that our time together is helpful as you reach out and provide the support that's necessary. Thank you, Dean Terrell. I am just so grateful for this opportunity to share, and thank you for your generous introduction. And it's humbling to call these offerings of mine the St. Luke's Lectures. So I'm glad to be here. And although the landscape is different, I can't help being reminded of my own 3 years at an Episcopal seminary. I studied at VTS, and in that rhythm of work, study, and shared meals, I grew in ways that I couldn't have imagined. And I'm just grateful for the community that I feel here. And I have to say a brief word of gratitude to 2 of your faculty members who have a talent for keeping me laughing. Hannah Mattis, who was a colleague of mine at VTS, and David Stark, a beloved homiletician and path-breaking scholar, and we have the joy of working together. And I'm especially grateful for Sarah Limbaugh, who got me here through all kinds of hurdles so graciously. I'm looking forward to some great conversation together. So during our time together, I hope to offer a theological portrait of Pauli Murray, a freedom fighter, attorney, poet, and Episcopal priest. And Pauli was a person for whom self-definition was very costly. The barriers were many and varied, and one concerns language itself. Today, most scholars describe Pauli as gender nonconforming or non-binary, but Pauli had less agency around gender expression than many do today, and lived during a time when binary pronouns were commonly used by people of all genders. In conversation, I typically use she and they pronouns for Pauli. But for today's lectures, you'll hear many more she, her pronouns. And I use them for a couple of reasons that I want to lay out. First, to maintain consistency with sources and direct quotations in which Pauli uses she series pronouns. Pauli's gender identity was only shared with a very tiny inner circle that excluded most family members and friends. And so this meant moving through the world publicly as a woman. Second, race and gender shape dialogue. They shape how one is addressed and the tone of that address. And I want those subtleties to be evident to you in order to illumine not only who Pauli was, but how Pauli was perceived by others, particularly others in authority. And third, as indicated in this first slide, I want to reflect Pauli's more intentional usage of she, her pronouns after age 60 in ministry contexts. So in this ministry license, Pauli has stricken through the he, his pronouns and replaced them with she, her. Terms that might grate Pauli early in life, at say age 25 or 30, are readily embraced at other periods. For example, in the 1980s, Pauli joins a venerable African-American sorority, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and relishes in being called soror Pauli. In every case, I try to honor the fullness of Pauli's identity and the need for the visibility of historical figures who were trans or non-binary. And I respect the fact that we're working with historical fragments and don't know which pronouns Pauli would choose today. As Jen Mannion suggests, studying people from earlier historical contexts whose gender transitions were gradual, partial, or whose gender identities were not publicly known during their lifetime requires attention to the uniqueness of each case and openness to ambiguity. Pauli Murray scholars are taking different approaches to these questions, but all with a great deal of humility. So with that framework in mind, let's turn to this first lecture, Thy Will Be Done, Pauli and the Picket Sign. In this lecture, I'll first provide a fairly detailed biographical sketch that provides a sense of the full arc of Pauli Murray's life. And then I'll turn back to a key turning point that served as the seedbed for a lifetime of faith-driven advocacy. And finally, I'll close with a discussion of implications for Pauli's prayer life. Ultimately, I hope to offer a theological portrait of Pauli that highlights the role of protest in her spirituality. And I want to challenge a contemporary tendency of treating Pauli as a civil rights figure who kind of gets religion at the end and becomes an Episcopal priest, treating that priesthood as a kind of cherry on top rather than something that is progressing throughout the whole of Pauli's life. Sunday, November 20th, 1910, was Baltimore's coldest day since the winter of that year. Bells tolled to announce the beginning and ends of shifts for the African Americans and immigrants from Greece, Lithuania, Italy, and Poland who sweated in the garment factories, fertilizer plants, and steel mills of the city. Those fortunate enough to have the day off shivered in churches or huddled together over bowls of soup. On that chilly Sunday, in that gritty city, a beautiful thing happened. Pauli Murray was born, the fourth child of Agnes Fitzgerald Murray a nurse, and William Murray, a school principal. Theirs was not a marriage of perpetual bliss. It was a union strained by the pressures of eking out a life in a bustling city. Emotions often ran high between them due to a combination of natural temperament and William's long battle with mental illness. But on Sundays, they were soothed by worshiping at St. James Episcopal Church. The congregation was known for its social advocacy and for its remarkable priest, the Reverend George Freeman Bragg, a journalist and advocate for African Americans and child welfare. When Pauli was baptized on July 9, 1911, Father Bragg presided. The Book of Common Prayer instructed him to give hearty thanks to God and call the baby thine own child by adoption. The words would ring true in an agonizing way. In March of 1914, Agnes, just 35 years old and expecting the couple's 7th child, died of a stroke. William was in a years-long battle with mental illness and was unable to care for the children by himself. Pauli and her siblings were separated and cared for by other relatives. Most in Baltimore, but little Pauli was sent to Durham, North Carolina to live with an aunt, Pauline Dame, her namesake, and her maternal grandparents, Robert and Cornelia Smith Fitzgerald. Soon, tragedy struck again. In 1917, William's condition worsened, and he was committed to Crownsville State Hospital for the Negro Insane of Maryland. And the social stigma associated with mental illness at that time would haunt the family for years. Then in 1923, when Pauli was 12, William became the victim of a racially motivated attack. He was beaten to death in the hospital by an inexperienced hospital guard. Other family members tried to ease the void by telling vivid legends about Agnes and Will in order to give Pauli a sense of their personalities. And on some level, this seems to have worked because Pauli felt a certain nearness to them after their deaths and even described them as, quote, guiding lights from the invisible world. Aunt Pauline parented little Pauli with a quiet, intuitive, and yet firm hand. Shaped by late 19th century notions of propriety and racial uplift, she insisted that Pauli comport herself with good manners. Tensions often arose at mealtime. Once when Pauli was 5 or 6, Aunt Pauline made buttermilk pancakes for the family and placed one little pancake on Pauli's plate. "How come you give grandfather 3 pancakes and me only 1?" Pauli complained. She would remember this as her first protest against inequality. Later, Pauli would say, "I have never been able to accept what I believe to be an injustice. Perhaps it is because of this I am America's problem child and will continue to be." As a very young child, as early as age 8, Pauli preferred wearing what was then considered boys' clothing. Later, Pauli would confide that they felt, quote, inwardly male and outwardly female. Aunt Pauline responded with endearment, calling Pauli my little boy girl. In addition to honoring Pauli's choice of clothing, even buying a little brogue hat and coat that Pauli selected from a department store, Aunt Pauline allowed Pauli to chop wood and to take up a paper route, roles that were typically reserved for boys. But Aunt Pauline was less flexible when it came to attire for church. A lay leader at St. Titus Episcopal Church, Aunt Pauline insisted that Pauli wear dresses and that she respect the church's policy of only allowing boys to serve as acolytes. Apparently, this restriction did not inhibit Pauli's priestly imagination, though, because 8-year-old Pauli baptized a cousin and was unusually active in church. She played the organ, and she assisted her uncle, this is her Aunt Sally's husband, Reverend J.E.G. Small, who was a priest. When Reverend Small left Durham to pastor 3 sister churches in Croom, Maryland, Pauli came often and often visited for the whole summer. And she accompanied him as he made the rounds from church to church, and very likely to this Black Episcopal cemetery in Croom, in which the bodies of the deceased faced east, in keeping with African American burial traditions. The bonds of affection that Pauli experienced in Durham and Croom led her to describe church as an extension of the family home. But any early leanings towards the priestly vocation were stonewalled. The priesthood was understood to be a male prerogative. Now, one person who seems to have been intent on honoring Pauli's sense of vocation, despite the gender barriers, was Bishop Henry B. Delaney, a longtime family friend. On his deathbed, he blessed Pauli and called her a child of destiny. That encounter took place when Pauli was around 16, but it had a lifelong impact. It became the frame that Pauli used as a 75-year-old to interpret the whole of her life beforehand. And hearing that as a teenager led to Pauli feeling renamed and blessed to forge a new path and identity. While Pauli's baptism and birth certificates read Anna Pauline Murray, Pauli would use several names that reflected a more fluid gender identity, including Paul, Pete, short for Peter Pan, and Pixie. But not long after this blessing by Bishop Delaney, Pauli completed a legal name change to become Pauli. Immediately after graduating from high school, Pauli moved to New York, eventually enrolling in Hunter College, but matriculating very slowly due to limited finances. There were periods of intense study that were peppered with these long chunks of time that Pauli spent traveling, riding the rails, hitchhiking, and working. There was working, and then there was combing the want ads for better paying work. It didn't help that these ads were separated by gender. You know, there was women's work and there was men's work, and that made it hard for the application process itself. Pauli waited tables at the Alice Foote McDougal restaurant, a job that she complained about, but that was off limits to some of her darker complexioned friends because of the colorism that was so rampant in the job market at the time. Pauli also worked as a janitor, a typist, a switchboard operator, anything to pay the bill. These were very weary, stressful years, and these were years where there were multiple stays in hospitals for mental health crises. Curious about ways to resist authoritarianism and learn from freedom movements around the world, Pauli lived for a time in a Harlem ashram, a small intentional community that was guided by Christian scriptures and Gandhian principles. But she found the community rigid. and left when they would not let her smoke cigarettes. Pauli was convinced that writing poetry was her true vocation. It's just that opportunities were so scarce. So in 1938, she applied to the sociology department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, but was denied admission due to her race, even though some of her white ancestors donated money at the school's inception. During the 1940s, Pauli challenged Jim Crow laws on Greyhound and led successful sit-ins at 2 Washington, D.C. restaurants. And it was activism that really led Pauli to enroll in Howard University Law School. There, she came up with an argument to unsettle the doctrine of separate but equal in Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, people dismissed her ideas initially, but that argument later became a key resource for Thurgood Marshall and Spotswood Robinson in the Brown versus Board of Education cases. Later, Pauli had a very public fight with Harvard Law School after she applied to their advanced legal program and was denied admission because the school only accepted men. The rejection letter read, "Your picture and the salutation on your college transcript indicate that you are not of the sex entitled to be admitted to Harvard Law School." Now, typical legal challenges were closed to Pauli due to Harvard's status as a private institution. So in a final attempt to find a way forward, she wrote a letter to the faculty. "Gentlemen, I would gladly change my sex to meet your requirements. But since the way to such change has not been revealed to me, I have no recourse but to appeal to you to change your minds on the subject. Are you to tell me that one is as difficult as the other?" When Harvard refused to budge, Pauli attended the University of California. After crossing the country and beginning the process of settling in, a notice came in the mail. "We, the property owners of Crocker Street, wish to inform you the flat you now occupy is restricted to the white or Caucasian race only." The notice demanded that Pauli vacate within 7 days. Unwilling to surrender, she remained for weeks with police protection. But the emotional strain and the need to devote energy to schoolwork took their toll. Pauli decided to accept a room in the university's International House, where she made lifelong friends from all over the world. After graduation, Pauli began a career as a civil rights lawyer. She served briefly as Deputy Attorney General of California and on the legal staff of the American Jewish Congress before joining Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison, a major law firm in New York. There, Pauli mentored a young intern, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, with whom she'd later collaborate on pivotal sex discrimination cases. And she also met the firm's office manager, Irene Reaney Barlow. Now, Pauli had decades earlier been married to a man named William Wynn, but that union had lasted just about a week. All Pauli's significant romantic relationships were with women, and Reaney would fulfill the spousal role by becoming Pauli's closest confidant and life partner, though the two would never share a household. Pauli moved to Accra for a year to teach law at the University of Ghana and to help author its constitution and canons. And after returning to the United States, studied law at Yale. In 1965, she earned a doctorate degree in law, the first African American to do so at Yale. And you would think that this credential might help her find employment, that process would be easier, but unfortunately it was not. race and gender remained tremendous barriers. Eventually, Pauli found a position teaching American Studies and Civil Rights at Brandeis University in Massachusetts, and she flourished there. She really flourished there until Renee became seriously ill. Renee developed a brain tumor and died within months. Renee's death prompted the most wrenching season of self-examination that Pauli had known in her 62 years. Out of this anguish and a desire to serve the church as a perpetual memorial to Renee, Pauli discerned a pull towards ordained ministry. And she came to see ordained ministry as consistent with all of her prior work. So after a decades-long struggle of trying to find economic security, her sense of call was so strong that she gives up a chaired, tenured professorship and enrolls in seminary. And this is despite the fact that the Episcopal Church has not, at this point, ordained a woman. Now, from the start, it was clear that Pauli was an atypical student. Not many seminarians begin by correcting the seminary application. Pauli did. Pauli's application form includes multiple areas where the word he is stricken and the word she inserted. Some of the questions on the form are answered with sarcastic remarks. For example, the form asks, "Have you ever seen a physician regarding emotional or mental difficulties?" Pauli responds by writing, "Who hasn't?" What part did you take in student athletics and activities? Pauli's response, "Hardly applicable at this date, wouldn't you think?" These early tensions foreshadowed what would be a tough journey. Pauli described seminary as much more difficult than earning a law degree and harder than earning her doctorate. The sheer challenge of learning the content and integrating it into one's piety when one's spiritual life was in such a vulnerable place proved exhausting. Now, switching from general seminary to VTS midstream didn't help. And fulfilling diocesan requirements on top of all of this made for a grueling 3 years. Yet Pauli graduated from seminary, and months later, on a chilly January morning, January 8th, 1977, Pauli Murray was ordained a priest at Washington National Cathedral. A group of picketers gathered outside to voice their solemn objections, but they chose not to disrupt the service. And besides, any effort would have likely been drenched by the waves of joy flowing from the church into the city and beyond. News headlines as far as Australia celebrated Pauli as the first African-American female priest in the Episcopal Church USA. A lover of words, Pauli authored several books, including 2 legal texts, a memoir, a book of poetry, and an autobiography. Her aim was to write a volume on her spiritual journey as well, but there was not enough time. Pauli Murray died of pancreatic cancer on July 1st, 1985, and was buried next to Renee. So that's the full arc of Pauli's life. I just add that Pauli loved dogs, camping, and had a terrific sense of humor, even naming a beloved black Volkswagen Sojourner Truth. But overall, I hope you have a sense of the passion and integrity that ground her personality. I like to describe Pauli as a contemplative agitator because of the way she's catalyzed by both prayerful introspection and activism. But now I want to flash back to a little interruption that sparked this lifetime of faith-driven justice work. The great spiritual teacher, Evelyn Underhill, reminds us that a strange reversal of fortune, the frustration of obviously excellent plans, lies behind most of the triumphs of Christian history. And such was the case for Pauli. In the summer of 1940, Pauli was an aspiring writer working part-time and living in New York. And she did a little volunteering on the side for an organization called the Workers' Defense League, the WDL. And her friends at the WDL asked her to go on a quick errand to Virginia to investigate the case of a man named Donyelle Waller. Donyelle Waller is not a very well-known name today. But in the 1940s, it had the voltage of a name like Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, Eric Garner. Donyelle was a Virginia sharecropper who'd killed his white landlord, Oscar Davis. The two had had an argument about a wheat crop, though in truth, Oscar Davis owed the Waller family money for their share of the wheat crop, plus 3 weeks worth of cooking and housekeeping that Odell's mother, Annie, had done while Oscar's wife was ill. So that was an additional $7.50, a significant sum. But their argument was just over this wheat crop. Both men were armed. At some point, each reached for a weapon, and one fell to the ground. Donyelle admitted to the killing, but claimed self-defense. Quote, "I'm as sorry as I can be it all happened. I wasn't trying to kill Mr. Davis. I was aiming to keep him from killing me." After shooting Davis, he'd fled to Ohio, convinced he could never get justice in Virginia. But he was quickly extradited. He stood trial with a meager defense and was convicted of first-degree murder by an all-white jury consisting of residents who could afford to pay the poll tax. Of the roughly 30,000 voting-age residents of Pittsylvania County, Virginia, only around 6,000 could pay the poll tax. The remaining 4/5 of the population was effectively disenfranchised and also excluded from serving on a jury because the juror rolls were taken from the voter rolls. This plight was very common in 1940. 8 southern states had similar laws, and this means 10 million people, mostly poor whites and African Americans, were not able to vote. Donyelle was awaiting execution and seeking help to appeal his conviction when he met Pauli. The two met in his jail cell just a few yards from the execution chamber. During those few minutes, Pauli remembers, I glimpsed for the first time the horrible reality of capital punishment, the oppressiveness of his somber surroundings, the unrelieved gloom of barren walls and darkened cells, the desolate hours spent waiting, and the terrifying nearness of the electric chair a few yards away. I sensed the constant dread of a condemned man who lives each hour in anticipation of the certain fate that awaits him behind that door. The image of that ominous door at the end of that narrow corridor was never erased from my memory. No argument in favor of capital punishment has overcome the shattering impact of that single visit to the death house. Now, knowing Odell's fate was being determined by assumptions of white innocence and black depravity, Pauli's role was to raise money and publicity for him. In one of her earliest appeals, she addressed a group of Black Baptist ministers with a message that was so tearful and so timid and stammering that she had to hand her notes to one of the ministers to read while she sat down and wept. When she finally found her words again, they gushed out in a stream of conviction. That day, Pauli Murray preached her first sermon. It was not an interpretation of Scripture in any explicit way. It was an interpretation of a situation that, in the words of Katie Geneva Cannon, dramatized biblical conflicts of dominance and submission, assertion and deference, the righted and the outlawed, the propertied and the dispossessed. When Pauli finished, one of the ministers rose and said, "All right, brethren, you've heard the problem. What are you going to do about it?" And he put $1 on the table, and within a few minutes, $25.75 had been collected. That small offering blew into a full-scale campaign that took Pauli and Odell's foster mother, Annie, across the country to fundraise. The pair gave speeches in churches, lecture halls, before civic groups, usually to small groups of people, 20 people, 30 people. And Pauli's argument had 3 tiers. First, decrying the poll tax and its impact on jury selection. Second, revealing the exploitation inherent in the sharecropper system. And third, arguing for Odell's right to self-defense. She affirmed that Odell's life was worthy of being defended and deserving of state protection. Her appeals in speeches and in this pamphlet, All for Mr. Davis, involved the concrete exposition of Christian principles in the hope of building a movement of supporters. And to be clear, Pauli was challenging a wooden vision of Christianity that could tolerate Odell's death without flinching. A vision of Christianity that, despite what was said in its sanctuaries, was in practice a religious system that pandered to the powerful. William Stringfellow would later call this expression of Christianity a principality. Lifting the veil to a more authentic vision of the faith, rooted in care of neighbor, was demanding work. Part of the difficulty stemmed from the fierceness of the opposition. The governor of Virginia was determined to have Odell executed and had the political machinery to do so. But this work was also difficult because of the nature itself. Bill T. Jones says that engaging America's racial legacy is an expensive endeavor. Expensive. It is emotionally expensive because one bears psychological costs beyond any specific discrete task that's involved. For Pauli, this expense also meant facing her internal feelings of vulnerability and navigating the challenge of gender presentation. Around this time, Pauli had written to physicians to request male hormones and explained the mental conflict that emerged when facing the decision to wear a dress or pants. Dresses and skirts felt awkward, uncomfortable, but the speaking venues, especially the churches, expected Pauli to present in a specific way and would have likely been distracted had Pauli made appeals wearing pants. One listener was so moved by Pauli's appeal that he wrote a news article comparing her to Joan of Arc, fighting for the cause of her people. Complimenting her dress, he described Pauli as a pretty girl with fine features and an impassioned demeanor. Responses like this generated much-needed publicity for Odell's cause, but came at a steep cost for Pauli. The psychological and emotional distress was almost unbearable. But looking from the outside, the publicity campaign was a success. Odell became a symbol for sharecroppers and for the millions of Americans who could not pay the poll tax. Some supporters, like Jonathan Daniels, a North Carolina journalist, made Odell's case in newspapers. Quote, "It does not seem to me difficult to believe that the young Negro went to demand his rights more in terror than in murderousness. My observation is that more scared men kill than brutal ones. I can understand the contention that poor little Waller was the product of a whole system of racial fear." Other people showed their support by donating small sums. The 2 wrinkled dollars from a fellow sharecropper who was otherwise going to pay his grocery bill. Money that would have gone to packs of cigarettes or to lunch. All these gestures showed how invested people were in Odell's case. And Pauli fought for him until the end. On June 30th at 10 p.m., Virginia's governor announced, "The rights of the accused were not prejudiced by the class of persons from which the jurors were drawn." He went on to condemn the publicity campaign as widespread propaganda that lacked any regard to the facts of the case and grossly distorted the situation. He said every loyal citizen should strive to promote unity at this time. Pauli made a valiant attempt to get President and Mrs. Roosevelt to intervene, but this was to no avail. Odell was asked to write his final words. "As my time comes near, each second means I am one nearer my grave. I have asked God to forgive me, and I believe He has. All you people take this under consideration. Have you ever thought about some people are allowed a chance over and over again? Then there are others are allowed a little chance, and some no chance at all?" Odell Waller was executed on the morning of July 2nd, 1942. Pauli could not bear to attend the execution in person, but kept vigil all through the night. Afterwards, those prayers took form in an open letter to Roosevelt, voicing the deep worry that Odell's execution would embolden more racial violence. Waves of lynching followed, including the murders of Willie Vinson, Private Jesse Smith, and a brutal attack on a world-renowned tenor, Roland Hayes. And I'm going to try and play a brief piece by Roland Hayes.
On their
Other songs by Roland Hayes echoed in the homes of African Americans across the country, especially in Harlem. And this was because Pauli Murray had organized a silent parade to protest Odell's execution and mourn the lynching of Willie Vinson and of Jesse Smith and the attack on Roland Hayes. 500 people marched together, led largely by maids, laundresses, and garment workers, and this protest became the foremother of the 1963 March on Washington. Ada Maria Azazi Diaz once said, "I pray best with a picket sign in my hand." And I believe Pauli would agree. Odell's story launched her quest for a form of Christianity that could console and empower, that could equip her for the first, second, 12th, 25th rounds of resistance, and one that could help her look back at defeats without despair. I'll close with lines from a prayer that Pauli loved. Thy will be done on, in, and through this world with which thou art present, which is by declaration the object of thy care and the garment of thy praise. Here I accept in simplicity the mysterious drama of creation and destruction, and with that, my own contribution to the great purpose which I cannot discern. And yet, too, thy will be done by me at all costs here and now, over against this rebel world which so decisively rejects it. Amen. Well, thank you so much for listening. I wonder if any questions percolated for you. There are mics here, yeah.
Thank you very much. That was really wonderful storytelling. Thank you for sharing that. Did Dr. Murray ever reflect on her choice to enter law in terms of her faith? Like, did she ever make sort of a direct connection between those two things?
Yeah, so many of the direct reflections on it are in journal entries and diaries where Pauli is reflecting on the decision and the call to be a voice for change and justice. Pauli was clear from the start that it was civil rights law that was the appeal, and the aim of being someone who really corrected some of the injustices and imbalances in the law. So that was the place where I find the language most explicit in those diaries and journal entry reflections. Any other questions?
Thank you for being here. I guess my question centers around how did Pauli Murray become your muse, if you will?
That's a good question. Well, I'll say my first exposure to Pauli Murray was when I was a law school student and reading about some of the civil rights work that she was done. But I was asked to do, when I was teaching at Virginia Theological Seminary, I was asked to do what was called a Fridays at the Seminary workshop, where people from all over the city would just come visit for the day and have a day as a seminarian with, worship times and meals and class. And the class was, my 4 hours or so teaching about Pauli Murray. And And I went to the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, where Pauli's letters are, to prepare. And at one point, I was just holding a library card, and I just felt like we have a connection here. I have a friend who loves Evelyn Underhill and calls her an inner companion. And I actually experienced Pauli as a kind of inner companion, a spiritual guide and teacher. So she informs a lot of my own prayer and spirituality. Thank you for that question. Any others?
I have one. I mean, one of the things I find really poignant about Pauli is that, I mean, she's such a thoroughbred. I mean, she is nervous and high-strung, and she will make these sort of public statements, and then she'll sort of need time to go recover, recuperate. She's intensely vulnerable. So she's taking all these incredibly dramatic stances, but she's vulnerable all the time. And I mean, I think that's one of the things. I mean, there's a question in there somewhere, which is partly, I think, how does she do it? How does she keep getting up and starting over? But how do you see her sort of spirituality sustaining her in the midst of that cycle?
So Philip Weinstein has the author, literary scholar, has a phrase that he used that I find particularly apt for Pauli Murray, and it's someone who's driven more by tension than resolution, right? And Pauli's energy for activism, for pressing forward, was driven more by the tension than by the expectation of a definitive resolution. So this meant that Pauli's faith needed to provide that energy, needed to provide that calm, and also that sense of time, right? That reminder that I'm a creature in time. I make my small contribution that I believe is part of the effort of the Spirit in the world. And I trust that those things that can happen that I will witness are part of God's doing. And I trust that there will be a manifestation that outlives me. And I think that's very much the case because, Pauli Murray's public story has just blossomed in the past, 20 years, long after her death. So that picture of the big view of history was critical.
Thank you for painting that picture of Pauli preaching to the Baptist preachers, if I heard you right. What I wondered was how many, if any, of the churches she visited were Episcopal churches ready to hear about Odell?
That is such a good question. So I don't know if my paper trail gives me an answer to that question. I will say that most of the gatherings were organized by friends from the WDL, from the NAACP, and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So those are the people, and so the churches would serve as the venue, and so there would be a smattering of church members who were there. But I don't know of a source that would tell me how many were Episcopal churches. Unfortunately, I don't remember seeing those details laid out in the. Most of the records that I saw were references to cities, and very brief references to churches, but don't specify denominations.
So I noticed when you were speaking about the governor of Virginia that you did not name that person. I looked him up, Colgate Darden,
yes.
And I'm a graduate of UVA.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, do you know if there's any healing and reconciliation work happening around Darden at the UVA?
At UVA?
Yeah.
I don't. I'm not aware of what's happening there.
Okay.
Yeah. I do know that I don't, this might be interpreted as a push towards reconciliation. So after Pauli graduated from law school, she sent a note to the governor, and just sort of wanted to make the point, you know, I lost that battle, but I'm continuing in this struggle for justice. And Pauli kept watch of the Supreme Court cases around the poll tax and was, you know, rejoiced when, you know, those laws were overturned. So I think there was, at least on Pauli's side, this desire to see progress, but, you know, in terms of what's happening on the ground at UVA or has happened, I'm just not
The
privy
Darden
to.
School of Business. Yeah, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask a question about the Workers' Defense League. I often when we think about the civil rights movement, we think about labor as being on the kind of tail end of civil rights. But what I'm seeing in your story about Pauli Murray and Odell Walker is that there's very much a concern for sharecroppers in particular,
Yes.
but for sort of that. I mean, it's a really intersectional story of race, gender, and class.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the cooperation of the WDL and the NAACP in this case.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I will say that there are some, you know, much of this was sort of a web of friendships with people who shared similar concerns, and there was clearly overlap in the people who were concerned about questions of race and sharecropping and everyday wage earners in New York. So I'm trying to remember the name of a dear friend of Pauli's who was instrumental in the WDL, but I'm just not drawing his name at this time. But you know, one way that they cooperated is sharing each other's resources for, you know, gathering people for, what would you call it, consciousness-raising events, and trying to pull from the same group of people in terms of fundraising. But yeah, I think it would probably be most helpful if I could give you the name of this this person, and I'm happy to fish for it and point it to you, because he was a key figure in selecting who went where to support different efforts for the different organizations.
Thank you so much for this. I am a student of Pauli Murray myself, and one of the things that is very impressive to me is in her early days when she was very poor and needing help. She became connected to Eleanor Roosevelt, and they became lifelong friends, and there was correspondence that, in fact, I have a book of their correspondence. And would you say more about that? Because I think their relationship was pretty important to her.
Their relationship was very important. You know, Pauli considered Eleanor Roosevelt a mentor and was leaned on her quite a bit professionally for things like letters of recommendation and guidance. I will say that Pauli's friendship with Carolyn Ware, Lena Ware, was a closer friendship. So even as Pauli and Eleanor developed this closeness, there was still a guardedness and And I guess that's true for so many of us, right? There are some friends that know one side of our lives and others who have a more intimate view. And there were many aspects of Pauli's life that she didn't share with Eleanor Roosevelt, but she was inspired by by Eleanor's, what she called generosity of spirit and integrity. And it was good that both of them could tolerate the sort of push and pull when they had disagreements. And that in and of itself was a sign of the depth of the friendship, that they could have disagreements. But I always find it helpful to compare that friendship with the friendship with Carolyn Ware, because you see Pauli's name for Carolyn Ware was Skipper, and Lena Ware called Pauli Pixie. Pauli would borrow money, take a much more dependent position. So you can see Pauli's neediness in that friendship in a way that does not manifest to the same degree in the relationship with the Roosevelts. So an important friendship, and yet there's a certain way that I sense that Pauli was always aware of the sort of social wall between them.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your questions. I think we will call this to a close so people can get over to Hamilton in good time.